Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6. Last week we looked at terrorism as either a theater of terror or as cosmic war. So in this week we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit. That was a little bit of a different thing that we've been doing. We had been looking at just these case studies of these different religions and different groups and things. So we're going to step back to that one more time. And this week we're going to look at Sikh and Buddhist terrorism. So as you complete the readings this week, again, think about those original 3 perspectives from Juergensmeyer, and then as well as these 2 forms of terrorism, either theater of terror or cosmic war, or both, and how you think those fit into what we're talking about. So Sikh and Buddhist, those are 2 religious groups that are probably less commonly associated with terrorism than all the groups we've previously covered in the course. Now, we're covering 2 chapters this week, which is a little bit different than we had been doing with these case studies. So I'm going to touch on both of them, but I'm obviously not going to be able to cover all the material included in the textbook due to time constraints when making these videos. So first we're going to talk about Sikh terrorism. So what's going on in India, that whole situation over there, really doesn't garner that much media attention relative to other conflicts that are going on in other parts of the world. But history has a long history of religious-related violence. India has a long history of religious-related violence. Juergensmeyer explains an incident between Hindus and Muslims that resulted in the deaths of many Muslim men, women, and children. And that's a more recent example of violence in India. Some of this violence is because there's tension between the various cultures and traditions, and whether or not India is going to be dominated by one of those traditions or will continue to be a multicultural state. The other issue that causes violence in India is religious movements that are fused, with political separation. The most common example of this is the Khalistan movement of militant Sikhs. And this violence occurred throughout the 1980s and 1990s. It resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, including the assassination of Indira Gandhi and the assassination of the chief minister of the state of Punjab. So at issue here was the oppression of the Sikh people by the Hindu Indian government. The violence also was to protect the Sikh community from secular influences. So the overall movement was to allow Sikhs to assert their rights and to have their demands met. And because they were an ethnic minority in India, they believed they had to look out for themselves, and nobody else would. So they used violence as a way to try to get what they wanted. So as you can see, there's a variety of viewpoints within this movement. But some did see the struggle solely as a religious struggle, and but by the mid 1990s, the movement was pretty much eliminated. It was, roughly from the early 80s to the mid 90s, and then it was pretty much eliminated. And some of the leaders did admit that using violence probably hurt their cause because it gave the government reason to forcibly attack the movement. So if we look kind of at the broader history of Sikhism, it's one of violent encounters in defense of their traditions, which is interesting because Sikhs are generally associated with being very peaceful people. But the foundations for the Sikh uprising were planted a long time ago. It all kind of started once India became independent from the British in 1948. Sikhs had been a part of that, in the struggle against the British and trying to gain independence from Britain. But then once it happened, the Sikhs felt marginalized and more on the periphery of the mainstream politics of India, even though they had been involved with this struggle against the British. So what they wanted was they wanted to control the Punjab region of India, but they were not allowed that because they were not the majority group within the Punjab. And essentially they were calling for a separate state within India, a separate kind of independent state governed by Sikhs within India. So how did we get to this use of violence? Well, Sikh tradition allows for a 5-member board to make decisions and provide community guidance. Now, it isn't really a religious order of priests or uh, made up of religious leaders, as in other religious traditions. If you remember, when we talked about Jewish terrorism, there was some tradition there for a council, the Sanhedrin, right, to make decisions on what was a just war, when violence was allowed. So this is kind of similar to that, but it's not made up of religious leaders. So based on this committee that formed in 1986, the Sikh militants felt they had a divine order to correct injustices and secure public order. So once again, here we are back, at a discussion of just war and framing conflict, as good versus evil. All right, so now moving on to Buddhism. Even compared to the Sikhs, Buddhism is really generally traditionally considered to be a religion of peace. Probably more so than any other religious tradition, that we'll discuss in the course. But like all other religions, there is some history of religious violence associated with Buddhism. The most common one that people associate with Buddhism is the Aum Shinrikyo gas attack on the Tokyo subway system. But there is some other Buddhist violence that is occurring in Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is a struggle with Buddhists against Muslims because the Buddhists believe that the Muslims are oppressing them and they're trying to eliminate Buddhist tradition. They believe Muslims are trying to do it by intermarrying with Buddhists and then forcing the Buddhist spouse to convert to Islam, and also concerned about Muslim influences from Al Qaeda and ISIS and other extremists. They also believe the government of Myanmar is trying to eliminate Buddhist culture. And this conflict has even been addressed within the United Nations, who did side with the Muslim minority in that portion of Myanmar. So this conflict isn't over, but it's been framed as, again, good versus evil, and as Buddhist morality against the Muslim hordes, so to speak, that are trying to conquer the country. So the most commonly known example of Buddhist terrorism is Aum Shinrikyo attack on the Tokyo subway system. This group attacked the subway system with sarin gas, and they killed 12 people. Now, Aum was appealing to people because it was not traditional Buddhism. It was more considered to be more transformative and prophetic, and was led by a charismatic leader named Shoko Asahara. Now, Aum focused on Armageddon, and Asahara combined prophecies from the New Testament, from the book of Revelations, prophecy from the Old Testament, some sayings from Nostradamus, and then also some things from Hindu and Buddhism, and kind of mixed them all together, mashed them up, and created his own version of religion. So when we talk about Aum Shinrikyo, this gets a little more tricky now. We start talking about it as a terrorist group versus religious cult. So was this a religious cult or was it a terrorist group? Was it both? So the decision for how to classify groups generally fall on what they were trying to accomplish. So what were their political aims? Were there any? Or was it strictly to try and fulfill some type of religious prophecy? This kind of exemplifies one of the core discussions that we have within terrorism research and also among practitioners. How do you classify these groups? The followers of Aum believed that the gas attack was kind of the harbinger, for this final Armageddon that was surely to follow, because Asahara had predicted this attack. Okay, so because they believed that he had predicted this attack, and they didn't know that their leaders were involved in perpetrating the attack, does that make it religious cult? Right? So even when they found out about it, they still didn't believe that their leaders and group members were involved with perpetrating this attack. They didn't believe the news reports. So how would you go about thinking about this attack? How does this differ, really from what we've been focusing on and discussing in class so far? How do you think Juergensmeyer would classify it? Does this sound kind of like cosmic war? as this theater of terror, with actors performing their roles. It's really an interesting case to think about, especially in lieu of what else we've been talking about, in class the last few weeks. Now, here's the really interesting about all this. Aum Shinrikyo was this brand new kind of Buddhist religion where it wasn't strictly Buddhist, right? It had all these other things kind of mixed together, but it was really appealing to people, right? And had lots of members. It wasn't just a handful of people that ascribed to this religion. And in Japan, new religious movements have continued to expand and continue to gain in popularity than other parts of the region that are surrounding Japan. Interesting, even more, is that membership in Aum expanded after the attack, and it's still around. Right, this group is still around, even though they perpetrated this sarin gas attack in Tokyo, and it's actually expanded. Right, there's followers of Aum in countries such as Russia right now as well. So this Aum Shinrikyo kind of incident is really an interesting way, to look at this, because then we start looking at things like, what was the deal in Waco, right? Were those extremists? Was that a religious cult? How do you start kind of teasing out all these different groups when you talk about terrorism, and extremism versus not extremism versus cults versus political terrorists, right? There's all these kind of different pieces that sometimes get lumped together, sometimes get separated. So kind of think about that while you're reading the Juergensmeyer chapter this week about the Buddhist terrorist stuff. All right, I'm going to stop there for this week. Be sure to complete your assignments in Blackboard, and as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.